There is a photograph from the 1942 Academy Awards ceremony that tells you everything you need to know about two of the most complicated women in Hollywood history. Two sisters, sitting in the same room, both nominated for Best Actress in the same year, one of them about to win, and both of them knowing with absolute certainty that the other one would never entirely forgive it. Hollywood has produced a great many rivalries. Studios manufactured them, gossip columnists stoked them, and publicists occasionally invented them from nothing. But the rivalry between Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine was not manufactured, it was not stoked. It was as real and as old as they were, stretching back to a nursery in Tokyo in the early 1920s, running through boarding schools and studio contracts and Oscar speeches and wills and lawsuits and decades of spectacular, operatic, very public mutual devastation. They were sisters who became stars in the same town at the same time, each one winning an Academy Award, each one becoming a genuine legend, and each one making the other miserable for the better part of a century. This is not a story about Hollywood. It's a story about a family, and families, as anyone who has one will tell you, can do far more damage than any studio ever could. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The beginning, a nursery in Tokyo. The story starts, as so many of the more interesting stories do, in the wrong country. Walter de Havilland was a British patent attorney who had emigrated to Japan, where he taught English at the Imperial University in Tokyo. His wife, Lillian Fontaine, was an actress of some ambition and considerable beauty who had left England for Japan and then found, as one does, that life had other plans. Their first daughter, Olivia Mary de Havilland, was born on July 1st, 1916 in Tokyo. She came into the world at the beginning of a century that would be defined by upheaval, and she would spend the next 100+ years obliging that theme. 2 years later, on October 22nd, 1917, a second daughter arrived. They named her Joan de Beauvoir de Havilland. The middle name was pure theatrical affectation on Lillian's part, a nod to Simone de Beauvoir's aristocratic-sounding family name that she happened to admire. Joan did not inherit her mother's love of theatrical affectation. She inherited something more useful, her mother's looks and an absolutely volcanic sense of how to deploy them. For the first 5 years of Joan's life, the four of them lived in Tokyo. Walter de Havilland was a gentle, somewhat remote figure who preferred books to people and was, by most accounts, a man whose emotional unavailability would echo in complicated ways through both his daughters' lives. Lillian was vibrant, dramatic, the sun of her own small solar system, and from the earliest photographs you can see that Olivia was the one who most caught her mother's light. Or perhaps Lillian simply caught Olivia first. The eldest always has a head start in the race for parental attention, and Joan spent the rest of her life wondering if she'd ever close the gap. In 1919, Walter de Havilland was diagnosed with tuberculosis and depression. The family moved to Saratoga, California, chasing a climate more forgiving to his lungs. It didn't help. By 1925, Lillian had concluded, not unreasonably, that her marriage was finished. She divorced Walter, remarried an American man named George Fontaine, and the girls took their stepfather's surname. Except here is where the story begins to fracture, because Olivia, 13 years old and already possessed of a stubborn will that would define her, refused to take the Fontaine name. She remained de Havilland. Joan, 10 years old and more accommodating, became Joan Fontaine. Two sisters, two different surnames, sitting in the same house in Saratoga, California, eating breakfast across from each other every morning, attending the same schools, sharing the same mother, and already, in this small and almost accidental way, beginning the process of becoming entirely separate people. It would take another decade for Hollywood to notice, but Hollywood always catches up eventually. Saratoga, the making of rivals. George Fontaine was not a warm man. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he was sufficiently distant and sufficiently given to preferring Olivia, who was older, easier, and had that quality of being immediately impressive that some children simply possess and others spend their lives trying to acquire. That Joan felt the imbalance keenly, Their mother Lillian, for her part, was a woman whose love expressed itself most naturally through expectation. She pushed both girls toward performance. Piano, dance, elocution, drama. She had been an actress herself, had dreams of a stage career that life had interrupted, and she transferred those dreams with considerable force onto her daughters. Olivia received those expectations like a directive. Joan received them like a burden. Olivia was the easier child in the ways that parents of the era prized. She was studious, graceful, composed. She had the kind of natural poise that teachers remarked on, and that made adults feel that she understood the unspoken rules of whatever room she was in. She did understand them. She simply chose with great deliberateness which rules to follow and which ones to challenge, but she chose quietly, strategically, with the patience of someone who had learned early that the battle matters less than the outcome. Joan was more combustible, more openly ambitious, more willing to make her wanting visible, and therefore more vulnerable to the particular cruelty of being compared and found wanting in front of an audience. She was bitten by a dog as a child and still carried the scar. She had health problems, a calcium deficiency that affected her bones and left her frequently in pain. She had, by her own later account, a childhood in which she felt perpetually beside the point. She also had, by most accounts of people who knew her at the time, more natural acting ability than Olivia. This is not a universally held view. Olivia's defenders have always contested it vigorously, but it is one that would eventually be settled, sort of, and in the most public way imaginable. The de Havilland girls went to the same schools, lived in the same house, and by the time they were teenagers had developed a relationship that operated somewhere between competition and open warfare. Joan later wrote that Olivia once broke her collarbone and that this was not exactly an accident. Olivia disputed this with the eloquence of someone who has had 70 years to prepare her rebuttal. The truth, as in most family disputes, is probably somewhere in between, the kind of thing that feels like malice when you're the one whose collarbone is broken and feels like a misunderstanding when you're the one who pushed. What is not disputed is that by the time both sisters reached their late teens, they were each, privately and with great intensity, watching what the other one was doing. The leap to Hollywood. Olivia got there first, because Olivia always got there first. In 1934, at 17, she was spotted by a talent scout while playing Hermia in an amateur production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Saratoga Foothill Club. Max Reinhardt, the legendary stage director, was staging a professional production of the same play in Los Angeles and needed a Hermia understudy. Olivia, still in high school, talked her way into the role, then talked her way into going on when the lead actress fell ill, then talked her way into a contract with Warner Bros. That last conversation was the most impressive. Jack Warner himself offered her a studio contract. She accepted without consulting her mother, without waiting to finish her senior year of school, and without, as far as anyone can tell, experiencing more than a moment of hesitation. She was 17 years old. At Warner Bros., Olivia immediately demonstrated the quality that would define her career and eventually make her a legend in Hollywood labor law. She was not afraid of powerful men who thought they owned her, but that battle would come later. In the mid-1930s, she was establishing herself, picture by picture, as one of the studio's most reliable stars. She made 8 films with Errol Flynn, who was by common consensus the most maddeningly attractive man in Hollywood, and who was by less common consensus also charming company when he felt like it. Their on-screen chemistry was the kind that doesn't entirely require acting. The films were not complicated. Captain Blood, 1935, The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, They Died with Their Boots On, 1941, Olivia was the beautiful, spirited heroine who was worth dying for. Flynn was the dashing hero who did the dying or the rescuing or both. The audiences came in enormous, enthusiastic numbers. Meanwhile, Joan had watched her sister depart for Hollywood with the complicated feelings of someone who has been watching their sister do everything slightly ahead of them and is very tired of it. She moved to Los Angeles herself in 1935, got work as a model, did bit parts in films under several different names, and spent approximately 2 years being almost but not quite successful in the most exhausting way possible. She was signed by RKO in 1937, which was a genuine step forward. She made a series of films that were pleasant, competent, and not quite enough. She appeared in Gunga Din 1939 alongside Cary Grant and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., which should by rights have made her a star and instead somehow didn't, because Hollywood in the 1930s had a gift for wasting talent in ways that would make modern studio executives weep. Then came 1940, then came Alfred Hitchcock. Then came the moment when everything changed for both of them, in ways neither could have entirely anticipated. Rebecca and the beginning of the Oscar Wars. Alfred Hitchcock had come to Hollywood from England in 1939, brought over by producer David O. Selznick to make Rebecca, based on Daphne du Maurier's novel. The film needed an unknown for its central role, the unnamed narrator who marries the mysterious Maxim de Winter and moves into the oppressive grandeur of Manderley, only to be haunted by the memory of his first wife. Hitchcock considered over 100 actresses. He tested Vivien Leigh, who he felt too knowing. He considered Anne Baxter. He tested Margaret Sullivan. And then Joan Fontaine walked into the room. Joan was, at this point, 22 years old. Recently married to actor Brian Erhen, who was nearly twice her age, a pattern that would repeat, and professionally stuck in a plateau that she found increasingly intolerable. She was also, in ways that she would only fully articulate decades later, a profoundly anxious person who had developed considerable skill at concealing that anxiety beneath a surface of polished composure. Hitchcock saw the anxiety. He didn't just see it, he used it. He encouraged her to feel isolated on set. He told her that the cast found her an outsider, that the crew thought she was difficult, that various people had said unkind things about her. None of it was true. All of it made her performance. The unnamed narrator of Rebecca is a woman who feels she doesn't belong, who is intimidated by the grandeur of the life she's married into, who is haunted by her own inadequacy. Joan Fontaine didn't have to act this. She simply had to be, with considerable artistry, herself, or at least the self she carried inside the composed exterior. Rebecca was released in 1940, won Best Picture, and made Joan Fontaine a genuine star. She was nominated for Best Actress. She lost to Ginger Rogers. She said nothing. She waited. The following year, 1941, Hitchcock cast her again in Suspicion, in which she played a woman who gradually becomes convinced that her charming husband, played by Cary Grant, which made convincing herself he was a murderer somewhat more difficult than it might sound, is planning to kill her. It was a more demanding performance, and she gave it everything. At the 1942 Academy Awards ceremony, Joan Fontaine was nominated for Best Actress for Suspicion. Also nominated for Best Actress at the 1942 Academy Awards, Olivia de Havilland for Hold Back the Dawn. The two sisters sat in the same room, each one hoping the other would lose. Joan won. What happened next has been told many times and is disputed in its details, but the broad outline is not in dispute. After Joan's name was announced, Olivia, who had reached over to squeeze her sister's hand a moment before, either in encouragement or in something considerably more complicated, became, by multiple eyewitness accounts, visibly furious. Joan later said that Olivia refused to congratulate her backstage. Olivia's version of events is considerably more dignified. The truth probably lived somewhere in the specific silence that falls between two sisters who have spent their entire lives in competition and have just arrived at the most public possible climax of that competition. Joan had won first, and whatever else happened between them over the next 7 decades, that fact never went away. Olivia strikes back. The legal battle that changed Hollywood. If losing the 1942 Oscar to her sister was a private wound, Olivia de Havilland was about to inflict a very public one on an institution considerably more powerful than Joan. Warner Bros. Had a system common to all the major studios of the era, by which stars were bound by exclusive contracts that studios could extend indefinitely for disciplinary reasons. If a star refused a role, the studio would suspend them without pay, and that suspension time would be added to the end of their contract. The practical result was that actors could be, and frequently were, kept under contract for years beyond their original agreement, unable to work for anyone else, unable to choose their own projects, owned in the most literal professional sense. Olivia had been under contract to Warner Bros. Since 1934. By 1943, she had been there nearly a decade. She had made 43 films. She had asked repeatedly for better material. She had been refused repeatedly better material. She had played decorative heroines in adventure films and been paid well for it, and had grown increasingly furious at the waste of everything she knew she was capable of. In 1943, her contract expired. Warner Bros. Attempted to extend it, claiming that time she'd spent on suspension counted against her term. Olivia refused to accept this interpretation and sued the studio. She was 27 years old. She had no union backing. She was fighting the most powerful studio system in the world with a single lawyer and the entirety of her considerable stubbornness. She won. The de Havilland decision, handed down by the California Court of Appeal in 1944, ruled that personal service contracts in California could not exceed 7 years, including any suspensions. It effectively ended the studio system's ability to keep actors in perpetual contractual servitude. Every actor working in Hollywood today owes something to that ruling. Every director, every screenwriter. Olivia de Havilland, at 27, fundamentally restructured the economics of the film industry through sheer refusal to be owned. Joan Fontaine watched all of this from RKO and said later that she had not been surprised. She knew, she said, what Olivia was made of. She said this in a tone that made it clear she did not entirely mean it as a compliment. The second Oscar, Olivia's Revenge and Its Price. Now free to choose her own projects, Olivia made To Each His Own, 1946, a melodrama about a woman who gives up her illegitimate son and spends decades regretting it. It was exactly the kind of material she'd been asking for throughout her Warner Bros. Years. Emotionally demanding, complex, the sort of role that requires an actress to be present in every frame in a way that decorative heroines do not. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The following year, 1948, she won it again for The Snake Pit, a harrowing film about a woman committed to a mental institution that is also, not coincidentally, one of the most technically demanding performances in Hollywood history. 2 Oscars. Joan had 1, Olivia had 2. This is not a competition that was ever stated out loud. It didn't need to be. Joan, for her part, had continued working throughout this period, mostly at RKO and later as an independent. She was good in things that deserved her and occasionally wasted in things that didn't. She made Letter from an Unknown Woman in 1948, directed by Max O'Fells, one of the genuinely great films of the late 1940s, in which she plays a woman who loves a man who never quite notices her enough to remember who she is. It is a performance of heartbreaking precision, and it received considerably less attention than it deserved, partly because by 1948 the cultural conversation had moved on from Joan Fontaine and was busying itself with other things. She was not nominated for an Oscar for Letter from an Unknown Woman. This remains one of the Academy's more inexplicable oversights. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, both sisters worked steadily. Both sisters gave interviews in which they declined to comment on their relationship with each other in ways that made it very clear what their relationship with each other was actually like. And both sisters attracted the kind of press attention that comes from being famous, beautiful women who are known to despise each other. Joan was married 4 times, Olivia twice. These numbers are mentioned not because they are remarkable. Hollywood in the mid-20th century regarded marriage as a seasonal activity, but because they hint at something about how each sister navigated the gap between public performance and private need. Joan reached outward for connection repeatedly, enthusiastically, and was repeatedly disappointed. Olivia was more selective, more internal, more guarded, and paid a different price for her guardedness. Both of them had children. Both of them had complicated relationships with those children in ways that echoed, perhaps inevitably, the complicated relationship their mother Lillian had maintained with them. It is one of the grimmer patterns in family histories. The damage doesn't just sit in one generation, it travels. Joan Crawford and the Complicated Business of Enemies. This script promised you Joan Crawford, and Joan Crawford you shall have, though perhaps not quite in the way you expected. The title of this piece refers to the Fontaine sisters as Joan Crawford's rivals, and this is true in the sense that both Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine were operating in the same Hollywood ecosystem as Crawford, competing for similar roles, receiving similar scrutiny and occasionally crossing paths in ways that produced sparks. But the more interesting truth is that Joan Crawford functions in this story as a kind of mirror, a figure whose own legendary ferocity, whose own absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly herself, reflects something back about both sisters and about what it cost to be a woman of ambition in mid-century Hollywood. Crawford won her Oscar in 1945 for Mildred Pierce, the same year Olivia won for To Each His Own. Crawford was not at the ceremony. She claimed illness, though the more accepted version is that she was too terrified of losing to attend and staged her acceptance from her sickbed with theatrical grandeur when she won. Olivia was there. Olivia was always there. The Hollywood of this era was not large enough for the number of enormous personalities it contained, and the social mathematics of who respected whom, who resented whom, and who was conducting elaborate Cold Wars through their publicists were considerably more complex than any film plot. Crawford and Olivia had a mutual warriness that never quite tipped into open hostility, but never resolved into warmth either. They moved in overlapping circles, were courted by some of the same directors, and maintained toward each other the careful, exquisitely calibrated politeness of two people who are both fully aware of what the other is capable of. Crawford and Joan Fontaine had a slightly different dynamic. There was a period in the late 1940s when Crawford was actively trying to acquire projects that Fontaine was also pursuing, and the competition for one particular role at a particular studio became sufficiently pointed that it generated gossip column inches for weeks. Who got the role is less important, ultimately, than what the competition reveals, that in Hollywood, even friendships are strategic, even rivalries have their uses, and even sisters can sometimes be recruited to different sides of a war that has nothing to do with either of them. What Crawford understood, and what both Fontaine sisters understood, was that in Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s, a woman's career was a finite resource that could be exhausted. Younger women were always arriving. The studios were always looking for the next version. The window in which you were the person everyone wanted was narrow, and what you did in that window determined everything. Olivia responded to this knowledge by fighting, legally, artistically, publicly, for better material and for the right to control her own career. Joan responded by marrying frequently and working constantly, and sometimes choosing projects that flattered her less than her talent deserved. Crawford responded by becoming Joan Crawford, which was both a strategy and a form of self-protection so total that it eventually consumed the person underneath. None of these strategies worked perfectly. All of them left marks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The public feud documented in excruciating detail. By the 1950s, the estrangement between Olivia and Joan had moved from the private sphere into something that functioned more like a public institution. Interviews were an art form in Hollywood in this era, and both sisters were masters of it. The smile, the deflection, the loaded pause, the answer that says everything while appearing to say nothing. When asked about each other, each sister deployed a repertoire of responses so precisely calibrated that journalists sometimes spent the entire interview trying to get a straightforward answer and left with 30 perfect quotes that could each mean 3 different things. Joan's approach tended toward the personal anecdote. She would share memories that were, on their surface, neutral. Moments from childhood, family incidents told in ways that happened to paint Olivia in a slightly unflattering light. The broken collarbone, the parental favoritism, the way Olivia had, as Joan described it, sailed through their childhood on advantages that Joan had to work for. Olivia's approach was more architectural. She tended to position herself as someone who would have preferred peace if only the other party had wanted it, while simultaneously making very clear, through phrasing of exquisite precision, what she actually thought of various things Joan had said and done. She never sounded bitter. She sounded deeply, performatively sad about the whole situation, which is considerably more devastating if you know how to listen. Both sisters, it should be noted, gave magnificent interviews. Whatever else the feud cost them, it gave them decades of excellent material. The specific incidents that the gossip columnists fastened on are numerous, but a few stand out. There was the premiere of Gone with the Wind in 1939. Olivia had a significant role in the film as Melanie Hamilton, to which Joan was not invited, and about which she made her feelings known with sufficient clarity that the story ran for days. There was the 1942 Oscar night already described, which both sisters continued to narrate well into their 80s in ways that had diverged so completely from each other that they might have been describing different evenings. There was a Screen Actors Guild meeting in the 1940s at which both were present and at which, by multiple accounts, an exchange occurred that required other people to physically position themselves between the two sisters. What was said is not entirely on the record. The people who were there seem to have concluded, wisely, that discretion was the better part of not wanting to be named in either sister's memoir. There was Joan's fourth marriage, to novelist Collier Young, which ended in divorce, and which Olivia declined to comment on publicly in a way that constituted a comment. There was Olivia's marriage to French journalist Pierre Galanti in 1955, and her subsequent move to Paris, which Joan described as Olivia abandoning her career to become a professional French woman, which was slightly unfair, somewhat accurate, and perfectly aimed. The feud was a machine that required periodic maintenance, and both sisters were diligent about providing it. The Long Twilight, Paris, New York, and Separate Silences. By the 1960s, both sisters had largely withdrawn from the kind of screen stardom that had defined their peak years, though neither retired in any official sense. Olivia lived in Paris with Pierre Gallant and their daughter Giselle. She gave occasional interviews, appeared in television films, wrote a book about her experiences in Paris, and maintained the kind of selective public profile that people who have been famous for a long time learn to calibrate with great precision. She was not gone, exactly. She was simply elsewhere and at a slight remove. Joan continued working in film and television through the 1960s and into the 1970s, taking projects that ranged from genuinely interesting to frankly puzzling, and continued to be, in every public context, exactly as forthcoming about her feelings regarding Olivia as the interviewer was willing to hear. She had 4 husbands in total: Brian Ahern, 1939-1945, producer William Dozier, 1946-1951, writer Collier Young, 1952-1961, and producer Alfred Wright Jr., 1964-1969. Each marriage ended. Each ending seemed to leave Joan slightly more guarded and simultaneously slightly more willing to talk about everything else. Her daughter Deborah, from her marriage to Dozier, and her adopted daughter Martita, from the Young marriage, had complicated relationships with their mother that, in Deborah's case, became publicly complicated in ways that were painful for everyone involved. Joan and Deborah eventually reconciled, but the estrangement, when it was happening, generated the kind of headlines that both women would rather have not generated. The pattern here is not subtle. A mother whose own relationship with her mother was defined by love that expressed itself as expectation and control, daughters who found that inheritance suffocating, reconciliations that came late, if at all. Olivia had her own version of this. Her son Benjamin Galante, from her marriage to Pierre, died in 1991 of Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was 41 years old. Olivia had divorced Pierre in 1979 and had been living in Paris alone for over a decade by the time Benjamin died. The loss was private in a way that Olivia's public losses never were, and she almost never spoke of it, which was its own form of testimony. Through all of it, the marriages, the children, the careers that wound down from their peaks and settled into the long, quieter work of just continuing, the sisters maintained their feud with the dedication of professionals. The later years, when the feud became the legacy. There is a particular phenomenon that occurs when famous people live long enough. The events of their youth, the rivalries, the feuds, the triumphs, and the humiliations calcify into legend, and the people themselves become simultaneously larger than they were and somehow also smaller, reduced to the most dramatic version of themselves. Both Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine experienced this. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, they were being written about primarily as the feuding Fontaine sisters, as though the 60-plus years of actual lives they had lived were really just a long footnote to the 1942 Oscar ceremony. Both sisters were still alive, both were in their 80s, and neither had shown any inclination to reconcile. Joan gave an interview in 2011, she was 94 years old, in which she was asked again about Olivia. She paused in the way she had always paused, the pause that contained more information than the words that followed, and said that she and her sister were estranged and had been for many years, and that she did not expect this to change. Olivia, living in Paris, occasionally commented on Joan through intermediaries in ways that were, in the precise and architectural manner she had always favored, not quite complimentary. They did not speak. They had not spoken for years, possibly decades. The exact length of the most recent silence is, like most things in their relationship, disputed. Joan Fontaine died on December 15, 2013 in Carmel, California. She was 96 years old. Olivia de Havilland, living in Paris, was informed of her sister's death by a reporter who called for comment. She was 97 years old, and she was the last one left. What Olivia said exactly has been reported in several versions. What the various versions agree on is that the response was brief, composed, and not warm. The woman who had spent 8 decades being publicly composed about her feelings regarding her sister was composed about her feelings regarding her sister's death. Whatever she felt privately, and she was a private woman who had spent a lifetime protecting her interior life from exactly this kind of exposure, she kept to herself, which is in its way the most Olivia de Havilland response imaginable. The question nobody can quite answer. After a certain point in telling this story, you arrive at the question that makes the whole thing worth telling. How? How did two sisters, raised in the same house, by the same mother, in the same era, in the same industry, an industry that ate people alive, that chewed through talent and beauty and ambition with industrial efficiency, how did they both survive? How did they both thrive, genuinely and substantially, for so long? How did they each win an Academy Award, each sustain decades-long careers, each become, in their different ways, genuinely legendary? And then, having established that they were each separately extraordinary, how did they spend so much of their extraordinary lives making each other miserable? The easy answer is that the competition started early, was never adequately resolved, and kept feeding itself, that their mother's love was insufficiently distributed, that their stepfather's preference for Olivia established a hierarchy that Joan never accepted and Olivia never fully acknowledged, that by the time they arrived in Hollywood, the competition was so baked into their relationship that they couldn't have removed it without removing whatever else was holding them together. This is probably true as far as it goes. The less easy answer is that the competition was also in some ways fuel, that watching her sister succeed drove Joan to push herself in ways she might not have pushed without that specific spur, that knowing Joan was in the same industry capable of the same heights gave Olivia a specific kind of urgency, that the feud, for all its genuine damage, was also a relationship, one of the most sustained, intense, and consequential relationships either of them ever had. They talked about each other constantly. They thought about each other constantly. They each spent more words and more energy on the subject of the other sister than on almost any other subject in their lives. The estrangement was real. The silence in their later years was real, but the attention never stopped. You only conduct a feud that long, that publicly, that carefully, with someone who matters to you. You reserve that level of energy for people who are worth it. If Joan had truly been indifferent to Olivia, she wouldn't have bothered. If Olivia had genuinely stopped caring, she wouldn't have refined her architectural responses to such a pitch of precision. They hated each other in the specific way that you can only hate someone you love, which is not a comfortable thing to say, and is not intended to romanticize what was, by any reasonable measure, an often cruel and mutually destructive dynamic. Children should not have to compete for their parents' love. Sisters should not go decades without speaking. The things they said about each other in interviews and in private were sometimes genuinely unkind. But the love was in there somewhere. It had to be. It explained too much of the rest of it. What Hollywood took from both of them. It would be incomplete to tell this story without accounting for what the industry itself extracted. Both sisters arrived in Hollywood at a moment when studios owned actresses in a way that is genuinely difficult to fully grasp from the present moment. Your image, your name, your likeness, your schedule, your weight, your relationships, All of it was subject to the studio's approval and often the studio's direction. You did not date the wrong person. You did not gain the wrong amount of weight. You did not make public statements that contradicted the studio's preferred narrative about who you were. Olivia fought this directly and won. The de Havilland decision is her most lasting legacy in some ways, more lasting certainly than any specific film performance, however brilliant. Joan navigated it differently, using marriage and strategic availability and a particular kind of social nimbleness to operate within the system while never entirely being consumed by it. This strategy had different costs. It required more performance, more management, more careful attention to what the industry wanted from her at any given moment. Both strategies were exhausting. Both exacted a price that was not always visible from the outside. There is also the question of what came after the peak. For actresses of their generation, the mid-career decline was not just professional but deeply personal, because their careers had been so thoroughly tangled with their identities that the diminishing of one felt like the diminishing of the other. Hollywood in the 1950s and 1960s had, as it always has, very specific ideas about what it wanted from older women, and those ideas did not map neatly onto what Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine actually were. They were complicated people who had spent their careers playing, often brilliantly, the emotional truth of characters more complicated than the industry thought it needed. As they aged, the industry's interest in that particular kind of complexity narrowed. The roles that came were, often, a step below what they deserved. The exceptions were notable but not frequent enough. Both sisters, in their different ways, found other things to sustain themselves. Olivia found Paris, found writing, found the long, quiet project of maintaining her own dignity through decades of being discussed as one half of a feud. Joan found her homes, her gardens, her children and grandchildren, and the platform that her continued celebrity gave her to be, until the very end, exactly as frank as she wanted to be about everything and everyone. They were both survivors of Hollywood, of each other, of the particular violence that celebrity inflicts on people who haven't entirely chosen it, even when they think they have. The century that contained them both. Olivia de Havilland was born on July 1, 1916. She died on July 26, 2020 in Paris. She was 104 years old. She outlived her sister by nearly 7 years. She outlived most of the people who had known her at the height of her career. She outlived almost everyone who could have confirmed or disputed the stories she had spent decades telling about her own life. In her final years, she was not exactly forgotten. She received honors, gave rare interviews, was discussed with the reverence that Hollywood reserves for its most elderly survivors. But she existed at a remove from the world that had made her famous. Paris was her home, the apartment on the right bank where she had lived for decades, the quiet of a very old woman who had outlasted nearly everything. She was, in those last years, occasionally asked about Joan. She still declined to be unguarded. It was, in a way, the most complete and perfect final act she could have written for herself. She had spent her career playing women of restraint and depth. She had spent her personal life exercising restraint in the specific context of her sister in ways that were their own kind of performance. She held the pose until the end. Joan was gone by then, had been gone for 7 years, had died in Carmel in the house she loved, surrounded by her books and her cats and the accumulated objects of a 96-year life. The sisters are buried separately. They did not share that either. The legacy, what remains? 2 Academy Awards each. No, wait. Olivia won 2 Oscars. Joan won 1. This is the final numerical accounting of the competition that began in a nursery in Tokyo and ended, after over 90 years, only because mortality intervened. Olivia won 2. Joan won 1. But Joan won first, which matters, and which Olivia never entirely forgave. What remains of their work is genuinely extraordinary. Rebecca holds up. It holds up because Joan Fontaine's performance holds up, because the anxiety she brought to the role was real and translates across 8 decades. The Heiress holds up, Olivia de Havilland plays a woman who is plain and overlooked, and who eventually, after being completely destroyed by a man who never loved her, becomes something far more frightening than anyone expected. And it is one of the great American performances. The Snake Pit holds up. Letter from an Unknown Woman holds up. Gone with the Wind holds up. Or at least Olivia's Melanie holds up, even as other aspects of the film have required considerable reassessment. What doesn't hold up is the industry that contained them, the studio system they worked within, the contract structures Olivia helped dismantle, the specific cruelties that governed what women in Hollywood could and couldn't be. All of it looks, from the distance of 80 years, simultaneously worse than contemporary accounts suggested and more understandable in context than the present moment would like to admit. They were exceptional women working in an exceptional and exceptionally difficult environment, and they were also sisters who couldn't find a way to love each other that didn't eventually become a weapon. Both things are true. Neither one cancels the other out. The epilogue, what the feud was really about. At some point in the 1970s, Joan Fontaine gave an interview in which she said something that, buried under the usual repertoire of loaded deflections, cut closer to the truth than almost anything else she ever said on the subject. She said that she and Olivia were very different people who had made very different choices, and that she respected what Olivia had accomplished genuinely, and that she wished things had been different between them. Then she paused, and she said that she didn't entirely know when it became too late to change. This is the closest either sister ever came, publicly, to acknowledging that the feud had cost them something they couldn't get back. That somewhere underneath the decades of interviews and the Oscar mathematics and the precise architectural refusals to be warm, somewhere underneath all of it, there had been two girls in a house in Saratoga who shared a mother and a complicated inheritance and a talent that the world eventually recognized. That those two girls had wanted probably the same basic thing: to be seen, to be valued, to be loved not as the lesser version of the other, not as the one who won or the one who lost, but as themselves, separately, fully, without reference to the sister sitting in the same room. They never quite managed it. The industry that made them famous gave them the language of competition before it gave them anything else, and that language, once learned, proved very difficult to unlearn. Olivia de Havilland lived to be 104. She was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. She changed American labor law. She gave performances that will be studied for as long as people study film. She survived everything Hollywood threw at her, and then moved to Paris and outlasted the whole thing by decades. Joan Fontaine lived to be 96. She was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. She gave Rebecca everything it needed to be what it became. She married 4 times and learned from each of them. She was frank and funny and sometimes devastating and never, ever boring. They deserved better from each other. They probably deserved better from a great many people and a great many institutions. And the miracle is that they survived as fully as they did. The feud was not the story. The feud was what happened when the story, two sisters, extraordinary and damaged, reaching for the same thing in the same place at the same time, didn't have anywhere else to go. A final note: when Joan Fontaine's death was announced in December 2013, one of the first calls the press made was to Olivia de Havilland in Paris. She was 97 years old. She had not spoken to her sister in years. She had spent the better part of a century in the most sustained and public feud in Hollywood history. She gave a statement that acknowledged Joan's death, that expressed appropriate sentiment, that was composed and measured and gave absolutely nothing away. Then she went back to her apartment, and she was alone in the way that you are only alone when the person you spent your life fighting with is no longer there to fight. That particular silence is the only one in this whole story that neither sister ever described. It belonged to Olivia. It was hers, and she kept it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.